Welcome, everybody. I am Neil Duffy. I'm the Director of Sustainability and Resiliency for the City of Salem. This is a community meeting for a CZM-funded project that the city's a two-year project called Resilient Together Collins Cove Park Neighborhood. This is our first public meeting about this project. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that we do have Spanish translation available for this meeting, simultaneous translation. So I'm going to turn it over to Erica, the Spanish English interpreter, to provide instructions on that.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Erica, and I will be providing live interpretation or simultaneous from English to Spanish. In a little bit, they will enable interpretation. And if you know anybody or someone who will need interpretation, they can just click on the little globe and choose Spanish for those who will need interpretation. But just in case someone speaks Spanish, also you need to choose and in the little globe, choose English if you want to hear them. Just want to say this in Spanish, and then we will enable the interpretation. And just for the presenters, just a reminder to just speak a regular pace. So just I need to be able to catch up with all of you. Thanks. Mi nombre es Erika Pérez y yo voy a estar interpretando simultáneamente del inglés al español. Para si hay personas necesitan interpretación, está disponible, van a activarlo en un segundo, va a aparecer un pequeño globo. Hagan clic ahí si están usando la computadora y luego escojan español y listo. Si están usando un celular, hay 3 puntitos en la parte de abajo en el lado derecho y dice más. Busquen ahí interpretación de idioma, español y escojan español finalizado. Gracias. So if you can please enable interpretation.
All set, Neil.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erica. And thank you, Christian. So just a minute, sorry. Okay, so as I mentioned, this meeting is to provide an overview for Resilient Together Collins Cove Park neighborhood. We're going to do some welcome and introductions, which we're already in the midst of. Then talk about a little bit about what the purpose of this meeting and workshop is. We're going to go over a past study that was done and that was completed in 2023 on the Collins Cove to Willows. And then we're going to talk about this current study and project, and then some of the work that will be happening over the next year and a half. And we will then open it up to questions and comments. So just to get started, this is your project team. It includes Christian team, who's a resiliency project manager for the city, as well as me. And then Salem Sound Coast Watch will be the lead in terms of outreach and engagement with the community, as they were in the previous study. And AECOM is the engineering firm that we've engaged with for this project. And they also worked on the Collins Cove to Willows resiliency study. In addition to the folks you see on the screen who you'll be hearing from at this meeting, the city also, folks from our engineering department and our DPS department will also be involved in this project. And I also want to mention that we have some representation from Coastal Zone Management, which is the funder for this project, on this meeting, and they will be involved as well in a supportive role. So just to step back for a minute to talk about what Resilient Together Collins Cove Park neighborhood is. For those of you who may not know, Resilient Together was a joint planning effort with the city of Beverly that Salem undertook in 2020 and 2021, and created a joint climate action plan called Resilient Together, which identified a number of climate action opportunities for both cities. And it was filled with a number of goals and actions for us to take over the next many years to address climate change. Um, Resilient Together, Collins Cove Park neighborhood is an offshoot of that plan, but is also an offshoot of a study that was done a couple years ago called the Collins Cove to Willows Resilience Study, which was a high level analysis of the flooding impacts of the Collins Cove Park and Willows neighborhood. So as part of that study, there was a recommendation to focus on specific areas, and the Collins Cove Park neighborhood was a priority, was one of the identified priority neighborhoods that came out of that overall study. Before I speak more about this project and this study, I did want to just provide a brief update from DPS and in our engineering department on some temporary mitigation measures that some of you may be very aware of right off of Connors Road in the Collins Cove Park neighborhood. There are a number of 3x3x3 sandbag cubes that have been placed along the damaged seawall on that corner of Connors Road that you see in the purple there on this image. And then the city has also purchased a deployable flood barrier, which is 50 feet long and gets a little bit over 2 feet high. If flooding occurs, you can see in the image on the right, the water will cause the barrier to rise. The city has not deployed that deployable flood barrier yet this year, thankfully. And the plan from DPS is to remove the sandbags in the spring and then put them back in the fall ongoing. So this is the ongoing temporary plan as we strategize for some more long-term measures in the area. So I just wanted to make sure people are aware of that, and I'm sure you've all noticed the sandbags there. Just quickly, an overview of what the project area is. That if you look at this green oval circle, that's generally the area that we will be studying over the next year and a half. The red area that you see here on this map is the area that was studied in the last study that was done. And with that, I am going to turn it over to, I believe, Ellen Douglas from AECom.
Actually, I'll be jumping in here
Sorry,
first
Dan.
before Ellen does, just because I had a bit more background with the Collins Cove to Willows project, or we'll refer to it as the CC2W as the acronym that was what we used for the project. So as Neil mentioned, we felt that it would be appropriate before we get into talking about the current project to provide some background from the last project to tee things up. And so as part of that CC2W project, we identified priority areas based on a vulnerability and risk assessment. So the vulnerabilities that we looked at as part of the project included coastal storm surge, erosion, and precipitation. From that vulnerability assessment, we identified areas that were most severely flooded from each of these different vulnerabilities at 3 different time horizons, which were 2030, which is somewhat of a present day assessment, and then 2050, which is a medium term assessment, and then 2070, which was the furthest out time horizon that we looked at. Some of the prioritized areas that we looked at as part of the study included residential areas, critical roadways, and other areas with critical infrastructure that were identified by the city of Salem. Next slide. So as part of the coastal storm surge portion of the vulnerability assessment, we use the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model, or the MCFRM, which is the best available future flood risk modeling that's available for the entire state of Massachusetts. It was a modeling assessment that was completed by Woods Hole Group, and continues to be updated with new information, and really is the best available coastal modeling data available for the state. It's also been used for other resilience projects in Salem, and it's a probabilistic model which simulates thousands of storms, including hurricanes and nor'easters, and accounts for future sea level rise and climate change. It's important to note that the model does not include precipitation-based flooding or from rainfall. So that's why we incorporated rainfall modeling, which Tyler is going to talk about in some subsequent slides. The modeling results were for 2030, 2050, and 2070 conditions. Next slide. So these two images show MCFRM results based on probabilities of flooding in the vicinity of Collins Cove Park. So the figure on the left shows probabilities for a present day significant storm event, while on the right side, we were showing flooding probabilities for that same significant storm event, but with 2050 sea level rise included in those water levels. So as you can see, the probabilities for that same storm are much different with present day water level conditions, and then in future conditions with sea level rise included. In the vicinity of Collins Cove Park, which is right around where you can see the number 19, 18, and 17, which are identifying coastal structures along the shoreline. The flooding probabilities are around 2 to 5% for present day conditions, where on the right-hand side for the future conditions, we see flooding probabilities at or around 100% in those similar areas in the vicinity of the park. So, it's and for 2070, the flooding probabilities would be even higher, or extend further out from that project area. Next slide. Following the coastal storm surge assessment, we also looked at coastal change, or erosion and accretion of different shorelines in the project area. We based the assessment on several public data sets, including a Massachusetts assessment of seawalls and revetments, which are shown in the image to the right as those different numbered segments of shoreline, which are some of the different coastal structures in those areas. We also looked at a FEMA Region 1 coastal erosion study, which shows future predicted erosion conditions based on historical data for 3 different time horizons. It's important to note that the predicted future erosion that we're showing in that image to the right is not based on the underlying geology or the state of the existing coastal structures. That was not factored into the study. It was the study instead was just looking at what historical shoreline change rates were and projecting them into the future, and is mostly just a tool to identify potentially vulnerable sections of shoreline to coastal erosion. And so after we wrapped up that erosion vulnerability assessment, we looked at precipitation based flooding. So I'm going to pass things off to Tyler Brinson, who's going to talk about that part of the assessment.
Great. Thank you, Matt. If we could switch to the next slide, please. So as Matt had started to talk about, an H&H model was built as part of the previous study. Now, H&H stands for hydrologic and hydraulic, where hydrologic explains how water moves over the land surface. So you can imagine when it starts to rain and you see flow moving over the street, over the asphalt. That's the hydrologic response. While the hydraulic response is how flow moves through catch basins, manholes, and pipes. So what the H&H model allows us to do is impose input files such as rainfall events and then coastal boundary conditions, and see how those two interact with each other, with the stormwater system. So why build an H&H model? I kind of just answered the question a little bit, but an H&H model is a really useful tool to identifying areas that are vulnerable to that precipitation over land flooding and coastal flooding, both today and projected into the future. Now, one comment that we've gotten so far from people is that their basements are prone to flooding due to higher groundwater conditions. That is not something that this H&H model will be focusing on. It's not a focus of this study. We understand that that's an issue in the area, but it will not be focused on as part of this study. So the H&H model was developed to represent the Collins Cove to Willows study area as a whole. The topography, the drainage infrastructure, including the pipes and the catch basins, and everything like that. If we could switch to the next slide. Once that model was built, again, capturing the topography and the stormwater piping network, the model was validated by running a storm through it that historically happened. We were in the field during the December 23rd, 2022 storm event, gathering observations, pictures, water depth, extent of flooding, and those observations were compared to the model outputs, and overall the model matched the observations really well, especially in this Connors Road, Collins Cove Park area. Once we had some confidence that the model was reproducing existing conditions, we were able to apply the H&H model. So to do that, the model was run for a range of storm events and planning horizons that include present day, 2030, 2050, and 2070. Those storm events that we ran, there were 2 styles. One is the rainfall, in which we ran the 5-year and the 100-year 24-hour storm events. A 5-year storm is a storm that you can expect to see once every 5 years. Same thing with a 100-year storm. You can expect to see a storm of that size once every 100 years. For the coastal boundary conditions, we looked at a spring tide, which is the highest tide you can expect to see once every month, and the 100-year storm surge. So the 100-year storm surge is a pretty extreme event. Again, it's the highest amount of storm surge you can expect to see once every 100 years. An example of this model application is going to be shown on the next 2 slides, where we're going to be showing you the 5-year rainfall event in combination with the 100-year storm surge. Next slide, please. On this slide, we're looking at the current day projections for when a 5-year rainfall event and a 100-year storm surge occur at the exact same time. As you can see, kind of on the left-hand side, that's our current study area where Bridge Street and Connors Road are. You can expect to see, under these specific conditions, a flood depth of around 1 to 2 feet. However, when we factor in climate change and we look at these 2 exact same storms, but they're projected into the year 2050, we'll see that on the next slide, that the extent and the overall depth of flooding are projected to increase. So again, before we were looking at around 1 to 2 feet of maximum flood depth. Now we're at about 3 to 4 feet, and you can see the extent of that flooding has expanded pretty drastically. That's one reason that we chose this area to focus on. And with that, I'll hand it off to Ellen Douglas to go through the next few slides.
Okay, thank you. If we could go to the next slide. So that's a review of the work that's been done already over the last few years. And so I wanted to talk about this current project, which we're calling Resilient Together Collins Cove Park Neighborhood. In the previous study, we looked at the vulnerability of the different neighborhoods in the area based on social vulnerability conditions, based on how accessible they were to evacuation routes, and also based on how susceptible they were to stormwater flooding and to coastal flooding and to potential coastal erosion. And looking at all those factors, we decided that the next step, which we're in now, would focus on this Collins Cove Park neighborhood area because it is one of the most highly ranked and most highly vulnerable neighborhoods in the Collins Cove area. Next slide. So just to give a little more background on why we selected this area, as has already been discussed by Matt and Tyler, we looked at flooding from a range of sources, including what would happen just from sea level rise, what would happen from storm surge that rides on top of that sea level rise, what would happen with flooding from rainfall events, and what would happen when all those things happen all at the same time, which has come to be known as compound flooding. So compound, when you hear the term compound flooding, it just means you have a combination of both rainfall-based flooding and storm and coastal flooding from an ocean storm. And as I said, this Collins Cove neighborhood was one of the 7 areas in Salem identified as high priority based on its vulnerability. And you can just see some of the pictures that show some of the flooding in this area from the 2022 event. Next slide. So the current project that we're already engaged in has the following objectives. We're going to further assess the project vulnerability to these flooding events by doing more in-depth analysis, by walking the site, by doing some topographic surveys, and by compiling more data that we can find for the area. Next slide. We're also going to take that information that we get from our site walks and from our topographic survey and from our data compilation and refine the hydrology and hydraulic model that was developed during the CC2W project so that we can better evaluate what can be done to try to prevent or at least minimize some of the flooding that has been observed in that area. Next slide. We're going to, as we're doing now and throughout the project, engage community residents so that we can hear from you the kinds of experiences that you are seeing from flooding and the impacts that it's having on you, so that we can, when we look at different alternatives for flood prevention or mitigation, we can take the real world examples that you give us into consideration. Next slide. We're going to take some of those objectives that we'll talk about or alternatives that we'll talk about in a minute, and develop some preliminary designs so that we know what exactly we need to do in order to implement those alternatives. And next slide. And then when we're done, we'll prepare a final report that summarizes the data we looked at, the models we built, and the findings that we got from all our evaluations. And those will be available once we're done with the project. And next slide. At this point, I'm going to hand it back to Tyler. He'll talk more about that data collection that I mentioned.
Thanks, Ellen. So a big part of what Ellen was just talking about is we need to get more data so that we can inform our study and also put the most up-to-date and best information into the H&H model itself. So this is a process that we've already started. We were out in the study area about a month and a half ago, collecting data that will go directly into the H&H model itself and improve the results that we get out of it. So what sort of information were we interested in? Well, we opened up certain stormwater structures and we took, we gathered stormwater pipe sizes and invert elevations. Basically, how deep are the pipes in the ground and what size are they? We also looked at manhole rim elevations. What's the ground surface like out here for each of the stormwater structures? We collected ground control points in Collins Cove Park and along the seawalls to refine our topographic representation of these areas in the model. And then we also just kind of walked around the study area and saw what areas, based on our experience as stormwater engineers, look like they would be prone to flooding. Now that's not necessarily enough. We would love to hear from you guys and your experiences during these storm events so that we can better improve the model outputs. But to continue with the H&H model improvements, if we could jump to the next slide, we'll show you some examples of how we're improving this tool that we have. So the first step to improving the H&H model is expanding the stormwater pipe network representation in the model. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a screenshot of the model that's shown by the yellow pipes. That's what's in the model right now. However, the blue lines, mainly the ones that are shown in the light blue rectangles, are stormwater pipes of interest that we want to add to the model to refine our stormwater representation. So that's one of the things we were in the field investigating, these specific areas and trying to get more information on them. We'll also be refining our catch basin representation. How do you go from that hydrologic flow over land to the hydraulic flow through the stormwater pipes? That's one thing that we're going to be refining. We're also adding more detail to the model's terrain by collecting those ground control points in Collins Cove Park. We're able to refine those flood pathways when it does flood in the model. How can we do it more accurately to represent the existing conditions? Next slide, please. So, as I said before, we want to hear from you. Your experience in the study area is one of the most important tools that we have here. What we have on the right-hand side of the screen, again, this is based out of the model that was developed for the Collins Cove to Willow study. So we have not yet expanded it, as I was just showing you on the previous slide. But once we have the model expanded, we need to make sure that it's representing existing flooding. So The model output on the right-hand side of the screen is for a 5-year, 24-hour event. Now, this event is projected into 2050, so it is a pretty big storm event. Again, that 5-year storm is a storm you can expect to see once every 5 years. Just to put some statistics to it, the storm has a total depth of 5.2 inches, and the storm shape, how intense the storm is representative of like a summer thunderstorm. So the last time, last summer is a time I would like you to think back to. And when you got a really intense thunderstorm, where did you see flooding in this area? Is what's shown on the right-hand side of the screen representative, or does it need some work? This is the information that we want to hear from you. And there's going to be different ways to do that. You can put some observations in the chat, but on the last slide, and I believe a link may be put in the chat for you to put your observations. Next slide. And with that, I believe I'm handing back off to Ellen.
Yep, I'm back. So in the previous CC2W report, we presented some alternatives that could be useful for protecting it or minimizing flooding in this area. And during this current project, we'll be looking at those alternatives more in depth for this area, and then developing some conceptual, which means sort of rough outlines of what a design could look like. So for the Collins Cove Park neighborhood, some of those alternatives could be just putting a backflow preventer on the stormwater outlet, or enhancing the living shoreline, or increasing the number of bioretention rain garden ponds. There are various ways that you can improve or reduce flooding through natural using nature-based solutions. We could also look at putting in a new berm if that was necessary, or evaluating floodgates or elevating roads. There are a number of alternatives that were possible, and we'll be focusing on what is actually feasible and doable for the Collins Cove Park neighborhood. Next slide. And so what can you expect moving forward? Well, we'll continue to collect data. Tyler and his colleagues will be going out for another, and Matt also will be going out for another topographic survey later probably in spring, after the snow has melted. We'll be taking that data and, as Tyler already said, refining and updating the H&H model, expanding its reach and making sure that it's accurate. We'll be looking more closely at the vulnerability assessment that was already done, and digging a little deeper in that neighborhood to make sure that we understand the flood vulnerability of the Collins Cove Park neighborhood. We're going to refine the alternatives and pick the ones that we think are most feasible for this neighborhood, and develop a conceptual or a schematic design for one or a couple of alternatives for the neighborhood. We'll also be having another workshop in May, at which we'll be presenting some results from this phase of the project. And as noted already, Salem Sound Coast Watch will be doing a lot of community engagement throughout the project as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Salem Sound Coast Watch to finish up with the last couple of slides.
Myself. Thank you, Ellen. I'm Barbara Warren, the director of Salem Sound Coast Watch, and Allison Fry is on the panel with me. The two of us are working, really want to meet up with people to talk about what's happening in your neighborhood. So we've already talked with some of the stakeholders and residents and developed a communication plan, and that includes doing gatherings in the neighborhood, We're trying to develop some street captains. We already have a few people who said that they are willing to go to their neighbors and learn about the project, then go to neighbors and talk to them. So we're looking for more street captains, particularly in the area of Planters Street, Osgood Street, Lothrop Street, and Beacon Street. We are pretty good, well set on Connor and Barton and Arbella. But we want to hear from you. We will be canvassing. We'll develop a flyer that explains to people where they can go to get information and how they can share what they're experiencing. So that's the canvassing we'll be doing. We also will do some walk and talks. You see one in the picture on the right that was in the previous study, actually out of the Willows. So we will be doing that. And our first one, it looks like the weather is going to be warmer and the ice is going to be all gone. So we're going to try for March 6th. It's a Thursday evening. We'll be at the gazebo next to the pickleball courts. We will put some flyers up in the neighborhood. We will share this on our social media, salemsound.org, and also on the Bridge Street Neighborhood Association, our city councilors who have newsletters. So we will work hard to get the word out to people, and we'll also talk to our street captains to help to share that. That's just our first one. So if the weather turns out poorly, we will have more. And I know pickleball starts up in May, I've heard. So we will be out there when people are using the park because we want to hear how people use the park. We want to get them involved in the alternatives for that the city might be able to do with the park. But we also want to hear what you've experienced for flooding. And so we have developed our first survey, and there's a QR code. If you have your phone, you can try your QR code on that. Otherwise, there's a link here, which I know you can't click on. We will also, if you type in Salem Public Input page, it will go to all the public input pages that Salem has, and you'll find this study, this project on on a website for this project, and all the information, the recording, the event, this meeting tonight that's being recorded, you can share with your neighbors, or you can go back and look at some of the maps. And this survey is pretty simple, but really important, as Tyler said, for helping us with this project. So we would ask the date of the flooding incident, where the flood occurred, and just such a checkbox: groundwater, rain, ocean, other. Where you observed it. Was it in your basement or house? Was it in your yard, the street, Collins Cove Park, or other? And then there's a box where you can describe what you experienced and leave a message there. There's a map that you just click on, and you can move the pin to where you experienced, where you saw the flood or experienced the flood. And then we would love to have some photos. So you can drop an image here on into this survey. And then if you want us to follow up with you, you can leave your name, your email address, and you submit it. So it shouldn't take long. If you have multiple storms that you've been collecting information on over the years, you will need to do more than one submission, but please feel free to do that. Yeah, so we want to meet with you. I know the weather's been pretty bad, but it's improving, and this spring we will be out to canvass the neighborhood and hear from you. This is a 2-year project, so it does not end in June. We will continue into 2026. Next slide. I think now it's time for questions, and you can share your questions. Some people have already asked some questions on the Q&A. And there again this is a QR code for that public input page. But I know sometimes when I'm looking for it, I will just type in Salem Public Input, and the whole list pops up for you because the city has many projects that are up there. And if you want to reach out to us, don't want to use a survey or have some questions, there's Allison's email address, allison.fry@salemsound.org. It's 1L. And then for the city of Salem, it's Neil Duffy, nduffy@salem.com. Thank you. Neil, are you coming back on? Yep.
Thanks, Barbara. Yep. Thank you very much, AECom team and Barbara. And thanks all for your questions. I had answered a question about the insurer program. I'll just mention it now, and then we'll get to some of these other questions. For those of you, it's great. It sounds like some people are already aware of it, which is exciting. And for those of you who don't know, the city has just kicked off the development of a pilot resilience audit, home resilience audit program with a nonprofit called Insure, INNSURE. They're an insurance nonprofit. So over the next 6+ months, we'll be developing how that pilot program will work. So it's not available now, but we do expect to, as we're doing outreach for this project, we'd love to hear from residents about what would be helpful for them with such a pilot as we're developing. And we want to take advantage of the fact that we're engaging with folks about flooding in this area. And so you'll be hearing more about it. And if you're interested in that project separately, you can also certainly email me at nduffy@salem.com. And I'm trying to keep a list of folks from all areas of Salem who are interested in that project. With that, I think I'm going to go to some of these other questions and comments. Somebody Sue had commented, I think Tyler, to the question about groundwater and that it's not included in the modeling. Can you expand on that a little bit on the challenge there? And I'd also, before you start, I think I would say, Sue, we'd love to hear about your flooding experiences on the survey as well, and when you experience basement flooding and what sorts of events may cause flooding in your basement, because that would be helpful also for us to understand. But I'll let you expand on that, Tyler, if there's anything else to say.
Sure, I can just go into a little bit more detail on the different H&H models that there are, and there are many of them. There are H&H models out there that allow you to model groundwater. However, the focus of this study is looking at more surface level flooding from larger, more intense rainfall events and coastal events, kind of those storm events that you see come up the coast and you say, like, uh-oh, it's a lot more of those style storm events than more that the groundwater increases.
I would just add that that understanding where you're getting flooded in the neighborhood is important, because we wouldn't want to come up with a solution that puts more water in the ground, thinking it's taking off the road, but then it ends up in your basement. So, no inadvertent flooding by the solutions.
I see Mike H's question. One is, what of these identified actions have been completed since the conclusion of the first study? I think that was asked when we had the table up of the recommended potential actions. So none of those identified actions have been completed since the conclusion of that report. After the conclusion of that report, we decided to focus on this specific priority area. And then that was basically the menu of potential actions. And so now we are doing a deeper dive into this area of the city to decide which of those we think will be the most effective. So that was really providing the option of possible actions that we could take. It wasn't a recommendation to take them all. And then it looks like Mike and Sue also both asked about repairing the damaged seawall that's there or reconstruction of drainage. I think this study will be informing any potential repair or reconstruction of the infrastructure, the coastal infrastructure in that area. So you should not expect any significant projects there until the conclusion of this study. But the temporary measure that I had talked about at the beginning is the plan for that specific area on Connors Road. This project is focused only on the area inside the yellow circle. I was just wondering if it looks at the living shore that already was made along the Webb Street side of the Cove. And does this address any of the Columbus Ave flooding? So we won't be addressing the Columbus Ave area in this study. I think there could be some alternatives that may have an impact on the Webb Street side of the Cove, but the Webb Street side of the Cove is not part of the project area. Does anyone want to expand on that or say anything more about that?
Yeah, basically we're looking at the area that has the seawall from behind the beach all the way up to the end of Connors Street, where the sandbags are now, and then up, up also towards Planters. But that's the main focus. And although the community, the city, we all want to help homeowners, it's very difficult, if near impossible, to do things on private property. So it's really looking at what the city can do with what the city owns, which are the roads and the parks and the seawalls. And we all know that the seawalls need repairing, but we need to do it the right way. So that's what this is about.
And it looks like Sue is providing another great comment about some of the flooding she's experienced where some of the stormwater infrastructure was overwhelmed and it did not come over the wall. So I think these are the types of comments. This is great feedback already, and this is what
Mm-hmm.
we love to have. And I urge you to also provide these types of comments on the survey and any dates or periods of time where you've experienced this also would be really helpful for us. Let me see here.
Were there any at the beginning that we missed?
I know there was a question
No, there's
about
not.
the 100-year
Mm,
storm that it looked like Julia Neisel had answered about. The question was, when you say 100-year surge, a storm that would only occur once every 100 years with climate change, is that model still accurate? Or what we are, is a once in 100-year storm now likely to occur more frequently? And Julia said, 100-year storm has a 1% annual exceedance probability. With sea level rise, 1% storms in the future will have higher storm surges than 1% storms today.
and yeah, and so this gets back to probability. So in
Right,
2018, we had 3 100-year storms, or 3 1% chances.
right,
The first year that the Living Shoreline was built, in October, we had 3 nor'easters and a bomb cyclone in October. So, it's the percent, it's a probability, it's your risk, but it's
right.
It's
If we
like
experience one, it doesn't mean we won't experience another one for
Right.
another 99
It's
years.
like flipping a coin. Statistically, you should get a tail, then a head, then a tail, then a head, because you have a 50% chance of getting a head or tail. But in reality, when you flip a coin, you can get a bunch of heads together or you can get a bunch of tails together. So yeah, the probability gives us an idea of what to expect, but then nature gives us what we get.
right.
Okay, so I think Wait a minute. Let me see here. Oh, survey submitted. Excellent. I think it doesn't look like we have any other questions.
Mhm. So I would just encourage you to share with your neighbors the survey. We'll be working hard to get that out to as many people as possible. But the people who are on this call, we would appreciate it if you help share the word. And let Allison and I know if you want to meet with us or help, get the word out on your street or with neighbors in your community. Thank you.
Yeah, and then it looks like, thank you, Mike, for reminding me. So the recording of this meeting will be on the public input page, which is the link is on the slide here with the QR code. But as Barbara mentioned, if you Google Salem public input, then you'll be directed to a page with all of Salem's projects, and you can find Resilient Together Collins Cove Park neighborhood project on that page. And then on our page, the recording of this meeting, the slides from this meeting, as well as the survey will all be there. And then any other information that we have going forward will be there as well. And the Collins Cove to Willows report that we talked about tonight is also on that public input page. So it all can be found there. And
Yeah.
if people have trouble navigating, I would say feel free to email either me or Allison Fry, and we can direct you to the information.
And if this is new to you, on the Collins Cove to Willows, Salem Sun Coast Watch Allison created a story map that goes through the project. It also has historical maps and testimonials from neighbors, and we'll be doing something similar before the end of this project. There's also a recording of the history of Collins Cove, which I know many people have found very interesting. So do some exploring and let us know what you think. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I think I just want to thank all of the panelists, AECom and Salem Sound Coast Watch for helping out tonight, and thank all of the attendees for joining and for already engaging in us in a great way. And we're looking forward to hearing from you and working with you all over the next year and a half. And everybody have a great night.